Welcome to Module 7, Part 3, Emotion, Gender, and Literary Discourse, Women's Poetic Language. 1. Gender in Literary Discourse, Emotion in Literature. Discourse is a group of utterances regulated in a specifically arranged system of norms, having meaning and effect. It's a regulated practice which accounts for a number of statements showing a relation between power knowledge that affects individuals' perception and understanding. We are interested in studying the rules and structures that arrange this specific discourse, the spheres of exclusion that maintain the discourse, and the institutional foundations that create those sets of norms through ideology. Literary discourse is a literary practice that follows a set of rules displayed and regulated by the literary canon and literary criticism in a given culture and historical moment. It's an artistic linguistic practice that deploys literary meaning into the forms of the literary genres: prose, poetry, and drama. Feminist literary criticism since the 60s studies gender in Western literary history and canon. Literary discourse in the English tradition has been regulated by men. Male writers and critics have, until recently, been prominent as writers and critics. Feminist literary criticism has studied images of women in male literature, women's practice of literary discourse, what is known as gynocriticism, and how language and discourse by men and women construct gender, but also trouble established assumptions. Literary discourse has a specific relation to emotion. It evokes, represents, transmits, expresses, and communicates emotion. Therefore, it is able to create, regulate, and transform emotional processes in the reader and listener. Poetry is the genre that may contain more emotional expressivity and that focuses on the work of linguistic strategies to achieve emotional expression and create emotion. Emotion in literature is involved in the practice of the writer, in the intellectual that interprets, and in the reader that enjoys it. Romantic expression theory suggests that literature expresses the author's emotions in order to liberate them and give them meaning through clarity and intelligibility. A post-expressive aesthetic theory suggests that expression in art and literature does not originate in the author's emotions, but in the aesthetic and formal elements of the work itself. Affective expression in literature can focus on different aspects. It patterns and organizes appraises and perceptions, constructed narrative and stories, as affective memory does in the narrative genre. It can highlight the relation between body response, cognitive reflection, and symbol, as in poetry. The encoding and decoding of literary discourse relies on the cognitive ingredient of the emotional process. Language, as the artistic medium of literature, takes emotion into the symbolic level, which permits syntactic and semantic processing about evaluation, choice, and action. We can conclude that literature is a highly cognitive and emotional experience. It focuses on the key functions of language in the generation of emotions at a symbolic level. The literary work as emotional stimulus provokes emotions in the reader. It generates affective states and moods, influencing interpretation. I quote, "Affective states affect how people think about things, how they organize and use information, and what information they pay attention to, store, and retrieve from memory." Emotion discourse in literature rehearses the position between the self, others, and the world, ethically evaluating situations, agentically and assertively reflecting on our stance position towards the situation and our self-worth, and intersubjectively the social relations between self and others. Appraisal theory in linguistics that studies discursive resources to position oneself interpersonally and emotionally through evaluation, attitude, and effect can be applied to emotion discourse in literature. Literature exposes and reflects on the complex human emotional system. because language, and I quote, has brought humans out of the environmental conditions under which our emotional system evolved. We should regard literature as a space where to reassess and transform emotional regulation in individuals through discourse because, I quote, how we talk about emotions has a major influence on how we experience emotion. 2. Women, gender emotion stereotypes, and the poetic genre. Research in the psychology of emotion shows that the lack of a specific emotional situational regulations, as in instrumental needs in professions or social events, results in the highlighting and reliance on gender emotion stereotypes. The history of literary discourse in the English tradition shows that gender emotion stereotypes are applied to women since they have had until recently no authority or assertive position within this linguistic cultural discourse. Discourses need exclusion to generate its regulations. Women's excluded place within literary discourse is more emphasized in the poetic genre, as opposed to narrative and the writing of novels. Feminist literary criticism and women's literary practice step into discourse from the mid-20th century on, generating new specific gender emotion linguistic relations within literary discourse, modifying previous assumptions, practices, and ideologies in literature in relation to gender. Women's access to poetic discourse. There is a gender structure access to genres as a speech linguistic regulated activities. There is a more rigid gender accessibility to poetic discourse, and the reasons argued by feminist literary critics are the following. Virginia Woolf, for example, suggests that women have been generally positioned as other in male poetic discourse, as the muse. Therefore, it's more difficult for them to become the writer of the discourse. They have had a restricted access to classic education and high language. Also, poetry needs no interruptions because it's an intense moment of consciousness and attention in women's lives with domestic work prevents these intense moments of consciousness and attention. Gilbert and Goober suggest that the higher access by women to narrative discourse relate to women's skills and manners and morals. They have had also restricted access to the high status role of the poet as visionary and mankind speaker. Also, as they suggest, the lyric poem is the utterance of a strong and assertive I. Cora Kaplan suggests that women's access to high language as a public political and literary discourse has been denied because public speech is a male privilege and women's speech has a private nature as an extension of domestic discourse. As she suggests, a very high proportion of women's poems are about the right to speak and write. Also, she suggests that poetry is a privileged meta-language in Western patriarchal culture, a language about language, at the core of the symbolic power of discourse, dominated by ideology. Gender emotion stereotypes and women's writing within the poetic genre. Theodore Rothke, in Gilbert and Goober, suggests that women's poetry focus on interpersonal minor emotions, the personal, the domestic, lacking intellect and assertion, based on the ordinary and everyday reality, lacking universality and abstraction, that it uses intimate and private language to focus on the bodily human, lacking spirituality and transcendence. This has a relation to gender emotion stereotypes in women. Other related emotions, emotionality and expressivity of emotion, and no cognitive regulations to control emotions in order to use reason or intellect. 3. Women's poetic discourse, language and the emotional process. In a linguistic test is interpreted as part of an ongoing discourse which affects expectations and how we react emotionally to the text. How an utterance is interpreted does not depend solely on the linguistic forms used, but on the interpreter's view of the utterer. For example, Emily Bronte's fiction, was considered as lacking force and being too sentimental. However, using her male pseudonym, it was considered powerful and authoritative. The concept of woman poet isn't itself conflictive. The very nature of lyric poetry as established in male tradition is inherently incompatible with the essence of femaleness, assigned by patriarchal culture. I quote from Gilbert and Goober. The lyric poet must be continually aware of herself from the inside as a subject, a speaker. She must be assertive, authoritative, radiant with powerful feelings, while at the same time absorbed in her own consciousness, and hence, by definition, profoundly and womanly. End of quote. Poetry versus femaleness. Women's emotional double bind in poetic discourse. Woolf, in the essay Professions of Women, suggests that in order to be a woman writer, she should kill the stereotype emotional woman that is immensely charming, unselfish, devoted to family life, and sacrifice herself daily, never having in mind a wish of her own, but sympathizing with the minds and wishes of others. Kaplan, in the essay Language and Gender, suggests, I quote, that to be a woman and a poet presents many women poets with such a profound split between their social sexual identity and their artistic practice that the split becomes the insistent subject, sometimes overt, often hidden or displaced, of much of women's poetry. But how is language and the emotional process used in women's poetic discourse? Women's poetic discourse in the English tradition challenges gender emotion stereotypes through linguistic strategies. Some of the elements in women's poetic discourse are the following. Agency, reflection, authority of the poetic self. Women's poetry uses self-referential focus, reflection on self-definition and inner emotional processes. It displays self-evaluation emotions that require high cognitive monitoring. The focus on self and emotion may be related to the fact that women have historically constructed identity through symbolic capital, that is, building awareness of self and of emotional knowledge of gender emotion stereotype congruent behavior. Expressivity and affective discourse. This is the preference for affective discourse in poetry related to the fact of women being more externalizers. There's also cognitive monitoring of sentimentality in this expression, provoking distance, objectivity, bleak use of language in form and context. And social sharing monitoring, the sharing with the reader and the woman listeners of emotion as a way to regulate emotion at a cognitive linguistic level through reappraisal, that is the reactivation of experienced emotion through cognitive monitoring. So there is an emphasis on cognition in emotional expressivity. Intersubjectivity. The construction of emotion can only occur in the context of others. The social dimension of emotions. For example, happiness is the awareness that we are the object of others' love. Joy, the accomplishment recognized and acknowledged by those we love. Indignation, the misconstrual of one's actions or intentions by others. Others are always present in the emotional process. Affective moods. Emotional moods in poetic discourse are sustained through language, facilitating monitoring and achieving reappraisal processes. Negative moods such as melancholy, sadness, isolation have been proved to provide perception of differential details in emotional situations, particularizing versus overgeneralizing emotional knowledge and experience. The case of anger and love. The recurrent expression of anger in women's poetic discourse in the 80s, above all, is a challenge to descriptive prescriptive norms that regard inappropriate female expression of this emotion. Love and romance have been traditionally linked to women's poetry. Women's love poetry highlights the intersubjective, communicative, more than the sentimental, narcissistic aspect of love, as well as the sensorial connection in the erotic and sexuality. Silence, concealment, indirection, ambiguity. These are recurring strategies in women's armor poetics, as Gilbert and Goober call it. Regulation and control of emotion through language by implying meaning and relying on the addressee's correct emotional knowledge to infer and decode it. It shows emotional protection of self in relation to social judgment, and it focuses on the centrality of language in managing, regulating, and redirecting emotion by communicative, conflictual, indirect processes. Contradiction and conflict. Women's divided self, as Autor calls it, and search for self-definition in poetry. It shows women's double binds in relation to gender emotion stereotypes and discourses of poetic creativity and femininity. Linguistic processing of emotions is a way to manage emotion when facing a discrepancy between emotional experience and what the individual, following social regulation of emotion, is directed or allowed to feel and display. Body, senses, symbol. Women's poetry frequently explores bodily identity and physical sensory detail, what Autor calls imperative of intimacy. Women's poetic language emphasizes the connection between body and symbol in the emotional process. Awareness of and focus on the chain between bodily responses to stimuli, senses and feeling, and consciousness of emotion and language at a symbolic level. This is an emphasis on the cognitive magnitude of the emotional process by highlighting the key function of symbolic language and its connection to physical sensation. Poetic form. Emphasis on the form of poetic language, visual, oral aspects of design as coping strategies for emotion. Coping strategies of reappraisal of emotions include, among other mechanisms, interjection, symbolization, rationalization, splitting, or decomposing. These strategies are transferred into poetic figurative language and form. Form corresponds to defense and containment, while content to fantasy and impulse, according to Robinson. Formal control is recurrent in women's poetry as a cognitive regulation and reappraisal of emotion for writer and reader through the sensorial dimension, sight, sound, of poetic language. Conclusions for Part 3. Literary discourse has been dominated by male writers and critics in Western culture. Feminist literary criticism and women writers from the mid-20th century on have analyzed and modified the relation between gender and literary discourse. Literature evokes, represents, transmits, expresses, and communicates emotion. Therefore, it is able to create, regulate, and transform emotion. Literature is a highly cognitive emotional experience. It focuses on the key functions of language at a symbolic level in the emotional process. Emotion discourse in literature rehearses the positioning between the self, others, and the world, ethically, agendically, and intersubjectively. Gender emotion stereotypes have been applied to women's writing because there has been no authority or assertive position within this linguistic cultural discourse until recently. There is gender structure access to genres as regulated activities, and there is a more rigid gender accessibility to poetic discourse. Stereotypical beliefs in women's poetry emphasize the personal, domestic, the emotional in minor situations and romance, and the lack of abstraction, intellect, and universality. The concept of woman poet reveals a contradiction between the nature of lyric poetry and the essence of femaleness assigned by patriarchal culture. Main issues in women's poetry reflects the conflict of this split and women's right to speak within poetic discourse. Women's poetic discourse in relation to language and emotion challenges stereotypes. There is a high emphasis on the focus on self through self-definition and assertivity, awareness of others, the interdependent and social nature of emotions, and a high regulation and control of emotion through symbolic strategies and cognition, focusing on agency, reflection, intersubjectivity, and cognition in language. Finally, we have to regard poetry as an artistic space to perform, do linguistic practices that modify regulations on gender and emotion in society and literary discourse. Agency gives us the chance to create, choose alternative positioning in discourse as part of evaluation stance. This has been achieved by the professionalization of women in the literary market as writers, poets, critics, and editors. Following, there is a bibliography of the module for further study. Thank you.